So let's just do introductions, and then I'll go last so then I can talk more.
I'm Sophie, and I'm a parent of a child who has special needs. And I also took care of one of the people who worked here for many years, Pam Stenberg, until she died. And I've been volunteering here for about a year.
I'm Darlene. I'm a summer intern at the World Institute on Disability, and I'm here because I'm really interested on getting Arlene's perspective on the ADA.
I'm Jan. I'm a legal intern at DREDF, and I'm a rising 2L at UC Hastings.
And I'm Nancy. I'm the bookkeeper here.
I'm Namita. I'm an attorney here.
I'm Bobby. I'm an Equal Justice Works fellow at DREDF.
And I'm Nicolay, and I'm the legal secretary and a parent of a young adult with a severe learning disability.
And I'm Casey. I'm a legal intern at DREDF this summer, and I'm a rising 2L at the University of Denver Law School.
And that's Anne.
Hi, Anne McDonald Cacho, education advocate, DREDF parent.
So I'm Arlene Mayerson, and I've been here since the beginning. In fact, we had a predecessor organization, and that really started the beginning of DREDF. It's been like about 35 years. I think that we're going to have that anniversary soon. And it was interesting. We started talking in the other room because Sophie brought up Pam Stenberg, and I thought that would be a interesting thing to talk about. Basically, I don't have a talk prepared. I just wanted to be available for people to ask whatever questions you want, whatever part of the history in the 35 years that I've been around, which has been a very dynamic time in disability rights. Just, if you have a question, you have a issue, whatever it is, So when Sophie mentioned Pam Stenberg, I thought, okay, let's start there, which is really going back to the beginning of our predecessor organization, Disability Law Resource Center, which was a 2-year legal services grant that the Center for Independent Living in Berkeley actually got to do the first legal services for people with disabilities ever for the Legal Services Corporation. And so it was, pretty much like seat of the pants. And Center for Independent Living was on Telegraph Avenue, and we had like a warehouse across the street. And people were like, putting in carpets, and, everyone was doing everything. It didn't matter what your actual job was. We're just like, it was like very grassroots. And I had gone to Bolt or Berkeley Law. And when I took this job in disability rights, it was because it was a civil rights job, even though the whole term of disability rights, the whole idea of disability rights was not really not at all an established field. It was at its infancy and kind of unknown. So I'm going to say the thing about the parent, then I'll go back to that. So at the very beginning when we were forming, and Mary Lou Breslin, Pat Wright, me, and there was the director of the news center was Bob Funk. There was a very strong feeling about when this legal center started that the people that would be hired would have to be people that would be simpatico with the environment in which we were beginning to work. And the Center for Independent Living was the first of its kind in the country. It's the Ed Roberts Center, Ed Roberts and Judy Human, and who's going to be here at 4 today, and I urge you all to go down there, started this really revolutionary concept that people with disabilities could live independently, and that just because you needed help being fed, or you needed help going to the bathroom, or you needed some daily assistance, didn't mean you had to be living in a nursing home or living in an institution, which is where most people who needed that kind of help were. So at the very beginning, there was this idea of, the Legal Services Office being an extension of the Center for Independent Living, which was very much at the kind of epicenter of the emerging disability rights movement. And at that time, I was explaining before that there was a divide, and it might even go so far as to call it a rift, between the parents' rights movement and the disability rights movement. The parents' rights movement had been around for a long time, and there were organizations like the Association of Retarded Citizens, it was called then, it's called the ARC now, United Cerebral Palsy, and other organizations where parents were very active in just getting their kids an education at all, because kids were excluded from school completely. And Judy Heumann, who's getting this award today at 4, was a prime example of that, where she got polio when she was about 2 or 3, and she was using a wheelchair, and actually she was using Canadian crutches at the time because they still wanted her to walk. But she wasn't allowed in school. She went to school to enroll, and they said, you can't come to school. You're a fire hazard. And so she had the experience of being at home, and finally they set up a little intercom so that she could hear what was going on in the classroom. But she was at home, and she had a tutor like 2 hours a week. I don't know if you had a similar situation.
Me?
Yeah.
No, I went to school in the 60s, so it was like, right around 94, 142, so
I can't hear you.
we were integrated pretty much.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
I mean, I grew up in Sunnyvale, and so, I mean, I think what it was we were really lucky. We were an anomaly, and we were both, my sister and I were both kind of walking at the time, and, we just kind of got in under the radar. And so we were just in the classrooms. We just sat out during PE, though. We didn't really participate, but other than that, we were pretty lucky, I think we were lucky is what it was.
That's a very unusual situation
Yeah.
for the 50s.
Well,
Anyway,
it was
so-
60s. 60s. I was born in 62.
60s.
Yeah,
Yeah, 60s.
You were in high school early 80s, late 70s.
late 70s.
The law was passed, the IDA was passed in 1977. Anyway, the very robust just parent movement, and then this emerging disability rights movement, which was also coming up in the 60s and 70s, and the Center for Independent Living really symbolized the adult disability rights movement, and the kind of touchstone was independence. And what I was saying before in the other room is that, most of the people that were starting it, and, they were out of college, they were in their 20s. A lot of people had come from the East to come to Berkeley, where they, kind of the Mecca, because of the weather and because of the Center for Independent Living. And so there was this kind of feeling of at CIL and in the disability rights movement, that parents created another barrier. Because, first of all, most people in their 20s feel that way. They're trying to assert their independence. And then in terms of disability, the overlay was also a lot of people feeling like their parents had been too protective. They hadn't want them to come to California. There was a little bit of rebelliousness there, and or a lot of rebelliousness there. And so the idea of disability rights movement merging or working with or doing kind of or seeing themselves as one movement, let's put it that way, with the parents' rights movement was really unknown. And even for many, many years, and even still today, most Centers for Independent Living don't have a lot of parent rights work going on. But certainly at that time there was, so then what happens is there was a young woman just out of college, Julie Landau, and she came into, this big warehouse that we had across the street from CIL, saying, I want to be a parents' rights advocate. And it was like, what the hell is that? And Bob Funk, who was the lawyer who was the directing attorney at Disability Law Resource Center, said, I don't know about that, but you can lay the carpets. So she was like, doing all that kind of laying the carpets and, just sticking around until someone understood that she was going to start a parent advocacy unit. And anyway, so the first people that came in the door actually as clients, Pam Stenberg and Diane Lipton. And they came in as clients actually because the state of California had decided that they weren't going to be providing occupational therapy to disabled kids in school anymore, which was clearly illegal. And anyway, we got very involved with them. And gradually it became clear that, the parents, we created a big, first of all, statewide advocacy effort on behalf of these parents, because a lot of parents' kids were being cut from services, and then a national campaign where we ended up getting, I think maybe it's the first and last time, all the money withheld from California for special ed. I mean, it was like we were like dynamic, you know, a lot was happening. And then this idea became like, well, can there be a parents' rights advocacy unit at a Center for Independent Living's legal center? And there were a lot of discussions, very, very hard discussions, between the disabled leadership and Pam Stenberg and Diane Lipton about the role of each. And particularly Diane and Pam both had children who were intellectually disabled and very disabled in significantly disabled in most ways, in terms of daily functioning, needed 24-hour care and et cetera. Not like nursing care, but, you know, to be accompanied. And the question was, who speaks? Who speaks for those children? And there was a feeling in the disability rights community like, you don't, parents, because you're not disabled. They're ours. And then from a parent's point of view, it was like, excuse me? Like, you are using a wheelchair, but you're like completely like this brilliant hotshot person in the world, and you don't know my kid. My kid isn't you. And it was really a dynamic time at the beginning. And DREDF was the first really disability rights organization which ended up bridging that gap and really seeing a common interest between parents of disabled children and the disability rights movement and adults. And really, really, I think, put that whole coalition on the map. Very, very interesting part of DREDF. And you made me think of it when you mentioned Pam Stenberg, who was the most amazing person, and Diane, who, you know, just did groundbreaking work in the area of kids with disabilities, and you know, became very beloved members of the disability rights movement. So I'm going to throw that up for grabs. First of all, just this idea that who speaks for the children. I was just wondering if any of you had already thought about that. Have you ever been involved in that conversation, or, you know, does it surprise you, or do you have an opinion, or?
I had DREDF's education advocate involve me in that discussion because she made me realize that I had to let my son speak for himself as a high school student. And she basically sat down and said, okay, you go do this and we're going to talk. And then they told me, this is what we're going to ask for at the IEP, Mom. And I learned that I had to listen to my son advocate. And he had a learning disability. And that was actually a good wake-up call, instead of waiting till college to realize that.
Has anyone else thought about that issue or confronted that issue? Bobby, have you, in all your education?
Oh, sorry. Well, when I worked at New York's Protection Advocacy Agency, my first summer in law school, and I did all the intakes, and I would say a majority of our calls were parents trying to get guardianships, and P&As do not do guardianships because they see it as an inherent conflict of interest, that we represent the person with a disability, and that, you know, they won't even step into guardianship issues because, you know, it's seen as kind of usurping some of the autonomy of the disabled person. So it was really interesting. I never thought about that. So I think that's kind of a remnant of those earlier issues you were talking about.
And actually, Navita, you did, you know, we've never talked about this actually.
Yeah.
You did, well, tell a little bit about what you were doing in New York.
Well, when I graduated from law school, I was working in New York at an agency, a state agency called Mental Hygiene Legal Service. And we represented people who had mental illnesses, who were confined in psychiatric hospitals involuntarily. And we also represented people who were, I guess, the subject of a petition for guardianship. So we've actually come across a lot of the issues with regard to individuals who are intellectually disabled. And actually one of the first cases that I worked on at MHLS, it was a very, very, very sad case. This one woman who was very severely intellectually disabled had a number of health issues, and her mom was her guardian. And there was an issue about whether to stop medical treatment of her. And basically, there's a process involved with it. You have to go to a court and seek the, I guess, authorization to withdraw medical treatment. And this woman really didn't want medical treatment withdrawn, and the mom did, and the mom won. And it was this question of, who do you listen to? So when you were talking about who are you representing and who do you listen to, it really rang true for me, because that literally was the first case that I worked on, and the Court of Appeals in New York refused to take the case.
It says what?
The Court of Appeals, the highest state court, did not want to take the case. So it was,
I mean, so that's interesting too, because not only does it come up, I mean, it came up in, I was talking about the movement, but it also comes up as an issue for lawyering. Do you have a comment, Anne?
Well, it's a hard one, Arlene, because I think we struggle with this in our own family, in our own life, that you seek to find a protective balance versus give a person autonomy to the extent that it doesn't kill them. I don't think there's ever the perfect answer to that question. I think it's a push-pull, and you have to be humble enough to recognize when you need to step back. And I mean, it's not, maybe not a daily struggle, but you can't help it. My son is nonverbal, and so that adds a layer of extreme difficulty in advocating for oneself. I feel confident enough that he trusts us, his parents, enough to do that on his behalf. He's been strident enough in his life to, make his position known when he is not happy about things or when things need to change. And I think we're probably the best people or the best communication partners to understand that and pick up on those cues.
Yeah.
I mean, I sometimes bristle when, people say that we need to let go more, or he needs to be more independent, or why is he still living with you? But I never feel like it's not his choice. I mean, he communicates with his eyes, and he cracked us up one time, but to me it's fascinating that, people would ask him, well, don't you want to live on your own, or do you want to move out, have your own apartment? And he would say no, 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 no. And then you have to do 20 questions with him to query what he's thinking and get confirmation. And it basically came down to, why don't we move out? He likes his place. Why do I have to move? I like my digs, I like my room, I like my TV, my everything. So it's like, oh yeah, well that never occurred to me. That's pretty creative thinking. But I don't know if that question will ever be solved in my own mind or heart or family or yeah.
I mean, I think one of the things that happened through this, is like both sides learned a lot. And, even though it seems like, I think there was a lot of input from the disabled people who formed the disability rights movement to the parents about, you got to let go, all that kind of stuff. I think the disability rights movement learned so much more about really disabled people that they did not know. who weren't the leaders of the movement, who weren't like taking a lot of, risks out in the world and going to college and doing all kinds of things. So I think that the appreciation went both ways. I think the appreciation of realizing that, the parents had a very, very, very important role. And to the extent that the kind of viewpoint was simpatico.
Right. Yeah, and that's what I was thinking. Because my experience is, in support of the folks in the movement who did distrust family members, is that a good friend of mine, who we're still really good friends, when I was 19 and she was 16, she only had a physical disability. She's a brilliant young woman. And her mother, who was a nurse, actually put her in a nursing home. And it took us, about a year and a half to get her out. And she just moved in with me at that time. So, I think there's a...
Well, that was the thing,
Yeah.
and
Because like you said, obviously her mom didn't have the same values as the rest of the independent living or disability rights movement that you're describing.
that was like, and that was another thing that was happening at the very beginning of the movement, before even IDEA, is when the cases were brought, the predecessor, by the way, this is disorganized on purpose. It's fluent, so if anyone wants me to get more focused, just let me know. But the other thing that was happening before these laws, when the groundwork was being made for these laws that we rely on in our practice at DREDF, so there was a really great crusader. There were, maybe 5 disability rights lawyers before I started, and they were mainly focused on mental health issues. They were really mental health lawyers, and they were so few of them, and Tom Gilhole was a big hero, and he was from Pennsylvania, were bringing the cases to shut the big institutions. And it was, the 1960s, and Tom Gilhole and the law firm that he worked for in Philadelphia were all about, this is like a civil rights issue. These institutions are horrible, and these people are being confined, and they don't need to be confined, and it's terrible. And the biggest opposition that they had in bringing those cases was from parents who were like, oh my God, are you kidding me? What the hell are we going to do? And a lot of the people in the institutions had been there for lots and lots and lots of years. And so the family had just been functioning as though, with that person outside the family. And so suddenly it was like this huge, first of all, we think that's where they belong. That's where they'll be protected. That's where they'll get their needs met. And also we're not as a family really prepared to for this. So there was a lot of, actual controversy. Not just in rooms where Mary Lou and Pam were talking to Diane, etc., but, filing cases. A lot of the parents were bringing cases do not do this to us, or to our kid. And it came from, and that's the other thing, realizing that it came from kind of not a bad place, but as far as the person was concerned, like your friend, whether it came from a good place or a bad place. She was still in the nursing home.
Right.
Yeah. So, anyway, so that was a very, very interesting part of the beginning of DREDF, is to really recognize that the movement was about parents of disabled kids and disabled adults, and working together and, seeing the things that were in common. And that's the same kind of story, similar story about the beginning of the movement, breaking down the kind of diagnosis-based advocacy that had always been prevalent before really a civil rights movement started. Before the civil rights movement started in the 60s, each disability was a function of, defined by diagnosis. So the muscular dystrophy, the MS Society, the this society, the that society, and each one was so focused on a cure for that particular disability that they didn't necessarily have anything to do with each other except compete for money. And the one place they came together in DC is benefits. So there was the whole, what, at the time was the disability advocacy efforts were all focused on getting good benefits for people with disabilities, with the assumption that they were going to need to be supported for the rest of their lives. And so that was another big, potential divide. I mean, it was a divide and riff often. And so when DREDA first came to DC, everyone that was doing advocacy, most people, I should say, that were doing advocacy in DC were from these various diagnosis-based groups advocating for benefits. And then, DREDF was formed, and the reason why DREDF has its name is it directly comes from the line that was established by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Then there was the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund. There was a Native American Legal Defense Fund. There was a Women's Legal Defense Fund. So, we were very consciously in the tradition of civil rights. And so we came to town kind of, saying, we got to do things differently. We go ahead and get benefits, but, we're only about civil rights. That's the other thing. It's when we first came to town, it was me and Pat Wright, and we met with everybody, and we said, don't worry about your turf. We're not stepping on it. You can get as many benefits as you want, but we're here to do civil rights work. And so that divide and that struggle, which I think has also really come together in really amazing ways, was, we do civil rights. We want to be part of the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights in a major way. We want the civil rights movement to know that we're a civil rights movement. And we don't want to just be in the disability niche. And the disability niche was, what the powerful group in DC was at the time when we first started was, now it's called Coalition, it's CCD. Anyway, it had a different name then, but all the people in it were mainly concerned about, education and benefits. And so that was a real hallmark of DREDF coming to DC, is to say, we don't do anything else but civil rights. So that goes back also, I'll just tell you about when we formed DREDF and wanted to be a civil rights organization. People come up to me to this day, 35 years later, and oh, great, you're a disability rights lawyer. My aunt, da-da-da, what benefits can she have? And I'm like, I don't know. I have no idea. It's nice when people do know. I'm not saying that's good that I don't know, but it's I've never even looked at, except when we did the SSA case, I had to know a little bit. But, it's not what we do. So when we were going to start DREDF, the Disability Law Resource Center was legal services, so it was going to be, it's direct services. People came in off the street, we served them. And then when we wanted to have a national, legal defense fund for disability rights, the first thing we did is Pat and Mary Lou and Bob Funk went to DC and they asked everyone, who is the, hottest shit in race discrimination and women's issues and lobbying and legislative strategy in civil rights, this and that and this and that. And we, the staff, put together these books on all the major issues that were prominent in civil rights. So there was education and voting and employment and et cetera. And we did it from a disability rights perspective. And we worked really hard on those articles and books. And those were in preparation for this meeting, because the meeting was twofold. We were going to show the traditional civil rights community how the issues around disability were the same issues. We're similar. We're the same areas of exclusion and discrimination. And then we were going to get from them. So now you're all the experienced people in the room. You know, what should we know? And this all happened in San Francisco. And, you know, those of us who were involved in that very beginning, we all always joke to each other that we're happy we're in San Francisco because, you know, if we had asked them if they wanted to come to Cleveland, we probably wouldn't have gotten, but we got everyone. Everyone came. And, you know, that really set the stage for us saying, you know, well, first of all, what came out of that meeting was you can't stay in Berkeley and do this. You have to establish a Washington office. And so, you know, that from the beginning, we were very conscious about associating with the leaders of the civil rights movement. Any comments or questions on that?
You don't have any copies of those books, like in an archive or something, do you?
Yeah, we do. Oh, we definitely do.
Okay.
Definitely. I mean, yeah, we do.
Okay.
I mean, it's interesting because I did the one on education. And, you know, things like, did you know that in the oral argument for Brown versus Board of Education, one of the things that came up in oral argument was, well, if we're going to do this, next thing you know, we're going to have to let retarded kids into the schools. Now, what's interesting about this history also is 35 years later, we're still struggling to get the traditional civil rights community to get, not on a lip service way, and not even on a joint legislation way, but to actually get disability. Is anyone want to take, I'd like to hear from any of you about why you think that's true or any experience you've had with that.
I think people are too focused always on their own self-interests. It's very hard for people to really be motivated to work for other people. They want their, you know, those limited opportunities to come to themselves.
Any other ideas about why the traditional civil rights movement might not really get disability?
I think that it's, you know, there's so many different kinds of disabilities, and I think that it's a different kind of like consciousness about what differentiates a person with a disability, that it's not as maybe collective of a culture, or some people might not see it that way as, you know, race or something else.
Any other ideas about it? Yeah.
Oh, I know that working in the mental health field, there's a lot of stigma around various issues that it's just like you were saying before, just sort of putting you off to the side and not really thinking about it. So I don't know if that makes a difference at all with regard to including, you know, individuals with disabilities into incorporating them into the civil rights movement.
Any other ideas? Yeah.
I was just thinking that part of it is not wanting to identify with disability. You're just keeping that at bay. And two ways. People who are have visible disabilities. A lot of people don't want to associate with that or get connected to that. It's not part of my world. I can't identify with you. And then people with hidden disabilities, to me also, I think there's a sense that it's like a big fake out. Like, this isn't a real issue. You're making this up. You know, we have real issues here. We have a race. We're, like you were saying, we're collective. We can all see that we are facing the same things.
Anyone else have any idea?
Well, I think it's different models of discrimination that's really tough. I know, you know, if you think about, say, a store owner doesn't want a black person in his building, you know, that's racist, and the way you remedy that is you could sue and you could prove that he had animus and he didn't want this person in the building. But with disability, a lot of times it's more benign. They either have to change the entrance, remove steps. So for us, we see that as a form of discrimination, but a lot of civil rights groups, I think, struggle accepting that as a form of discrimination because it's not as malicious as, say, like pure racial discrimination.
Yeah. So, I mean, in terms of disability law development, the first national law on disability was Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. The reason Rehabilitation Act, any legislation that requires money to fund it, has to be reauthorized periodically. And it was in 1977, it actually started earlier, but so the Rehabilitation Act was going to be reauthorized as it had been, every 4 years or whatever since World War I. And at this point, though, it's 1977, so the disability rights movement had emerged. Centers for Independent Living were starting to be established around the country, and some people in D.C., Judy Heumann worked in D.C. at the time, some people in D.C. were very aware of were part of the civil rights movement and wanted to bring the civil rights movement to people with disabilities. And so this little provision was like kind of put in this long Rehabilitation Act, which said you can't discriminate on the basis of disability. And it was modeled exactly on Title VI, which covers race discrimination, and Title IX, which covers gender discrimination in educational institutions. And it was the same language, except suddenly it said qualified handicapped person cannot be, denied participation in or subjected to discrimination in any program or activity that received federal financial assistance. So it was snuck in there and no one really knew about it. And people talk about a lot, like there's a big debate, now we have an intellectual academy part of the disability rights movement as well. Big debate about whether the movement caused 504 or 504 caused the movement. And I think 504 caused the movement, and there were some people that obviously got it in there. But once there was a 504, it was a way for the whole movement to coalesce. It was a way for like the people in New York who were working on their little thing in, Brooklyn, and the person who was working in New Jersey and St. Louis and all these places, that suddenly there was like a common goal. And that common goal was, we now have the statute, which is, and now we have to figure out, well, what does it mean? And we have to make sure that it means something that will make a difference in the lives of people with disabilities. And so this gets to the models that Bobby was talking about. So, the first, since it was based on Title VI, race and ethnicity, and Title IX, gender, the model was equal treatment. You provide equal treatment to everyone, and then you have equality. But that was clearly not going to work for people with disabilities because, you could be treated equally to get on a bus, but if it has stairs and you can't climb stairs, you're not going to get on the bus. It doesn't require the bus driver to hate you or to resent you or anything. You're just not going to get on the bus. And at the time before the regulations, after just the law was passed, and before the regulations, there were 2 court cases. And one was, and they were both the same facts, and they were both about getting on buses. And one court said, discrimination? That's not discrimination. I mean, we'll let anyone on our bus. It just has stairs. And the other court said, well, if you look at, the ability to participate in programs or activities that are funded with federal dollars, the transportation dollars, this person's not getting that opportunity. So how can that be equality? And that was the big struggle in the regulations, and why it took, I think, from 74 to 77 for the regulations to be promulgated, and a lot of really, blessings in disguise happen all the time in movements. The blessing in disguise was that was 4 years of amazing coalescing and sophistication of a disability rights movement, because the disability rights movement now had one goal. We're going to get regulations, and those regulations are going to be meaningful to us, which means that we don't want equal treatment, we want an equal opportunity, and to get equal opportunity, we need barriers taken down. And that's like revolutionized the ideas of equal protection in the United States. Unfortunately, very ahead of its time, because the court was like, didn't get it. The courts didn't get it at all. They're like, if you can't do something and you're not hired, how the hell is that discrimination? And the very first case that went to the United States Supreme Court under 504 was Davis versus Southeastern Community College. And it was a woman who had a hearing impairment, a severe hearing impairment, who was already a nurse but wanted to be a higher level nurse. I can't remember the, RN, and she was going to school. And the issue was, she wanted to go to school to get this higher degree, and they said, you can't come because we need you. You can't fulfill the clinical part of the school because some of it is, in the operating room and other places where everyone's wearing masks. Because she relied very heavily on lip reading. And she could have also used an interpreter, but, she was getting by. She gets by pretty well with lip reading. And so the question came up because 504 is no qualified individual with a disability shall be discriminated against, denied participation, or receive equal opportunity in any program activity that receives federal financial assistance. The college was a program activity receiving federal financial assistance. Question was, is she qualified? And the Supreme Court decision is so fascinating to read because they're like, wait a minute. When it's a black person and when it's a woman, they're coming here saying, not only usually they have to say I could do better, which is another question, but are you kidding? I'm so qualified. And they're just not hiring me because I'm like of my race or my gender. And for this it was like, well, if you provide her some accommodations, she's totally qualified. And they're like, that's not qualified. So, that evolution was, and that's exactly when I came into this field. It's like right after the Davis decision. And so it was really interesting because there's a whole progression in the Supreme Court of like, very, very gradually kind of understanding. But that's a whole nother discussion because while the cases that have to do with the statutes, 504 and now the Americans with Disabilities Act, they say, the Americans with Disabilities Act requires accommodation. Okay. Okay, well, we'll do that because that's what the Congress said. But when it comes to the Constitution and the 14th Amendment and the protection of the 14th Amendment against discrimination by states, no, they don't get it. They think discrimination under the 14th Amendment means intent to discriminate. And who discriminates against the poor little disabled person? No one does that. We don't discriminate. We just don't accommodate. And so even to this day, under the 14th Amendment, there's not an understanding of how disability and this other model of equality really fits. And it's interesting because in the area of, for disability, I always say, like, when I'm talking to people from other civil rights movements, it wasn't like a choice. It wasn't like, should we have an equality model or an equal opportunity model, a same treatment model or an equal opportunity model? There's no choice. Like, if there's steps, people aren't going to be able to get into it. If there's no accommodations, people aren't going to be able to hear it or see it or whatever it is. So there's no choice. Whereas in the feminist movement, it became the raging debate of the 80s and the 90s was, should we ask for accommodation for pregnancy? And many feminists and many legal scholars throughout the country were like, that is a death knell. The death knell is to ever, ever, ever admit in any way, shape, or form that we're different or need anything special. And then, of course, what does that mean? Different than whom? White men. And so there's a lot of, debate in the legal theory about now a recognition of, well, wait a minute, white men are the standard. Is that a real good way to continue to think about discrimination? Like, you have to claim to be exactly the same or you don't get equality? And so there's, as you can imagine, there's a lot of debate about that, not in disability, because like I said, we don't have a choice, but in other areas, like, it's really being questioned. And in disability, it's kind of like understood. Yeah, the world was not built with disabled people in mind. So yeah, it was based on, and there's a lot of really interesting books about, the kind of ideal male that it was based on, like how the height of this table and the height of this chair and the, doorways and everything. I mean, it's not a mistake. It really was based on that. And what's really interesting, fascinating, that's come up in our work is that so was the disability codes. That's really amazing. It was based on a guy that worked at DOJ, Department of Justice at the time, and it's like a white male, tall, para. So we have all these things in the code which, people can't use, and it really didn't come up for us until the point of sale machines and the reach ranges that are in it's called the ADAG, which is the disability code, basically, compliance code. It's like the reach ranges where you can see where your line of sight is and where you can push buttons. It's like so many people can't use it. But this guy, he could use it. He had long arms and he had the use of his arms and he had, the ability to see up there because that's where his head was. And so even in the disability codes, you can see now, like, we're really starting to say, well, okay, and what if you don't have arms? And what if you're, 5 feet tall? And what if you, so it's interesting. I mean, even within disability, there's this idea of who are you comparing to? So, the idea of universality is to try to broaden that concept of normal. Any comments or reactions or? I mean, it's interesting, I saw in the paper the other day that there was, I think I saw it on Facebook actually, there was a, girl who was blind and they wouldn't let her ride the rides in an amusement park. Did you see this? So, it's just like the other day in the paper and I thought, or whatever. And I thought, it's so interesting because, the article is about her mom and her, like, they were so devastated because they had never even approached the world because she's little. She's and her mom's experience had been within this context of at least there being a disability rights movement. But the disability rights movement, I think, is really far ahead of where society is. So this blind girl was like, and the guy who told her she couldn't use the ride, he probably wasn't a monstrous guy. He probably wasn't someone who thought he was a mean ass, And I think it's still really interesting because things that would be very obvious in another context, like we don't let black people go on our rides, would be bizarre. But because the girl was blind, they think that the guy probably felt like, that's not safe. you know. Really interesting case came up in the Supreme Court, which was about whether in the ADA, which I was very involved in writing, which if we could get more to if you want to know, really involved in writing all the sections mainly, but particularly some very intensely. And one of them was this issue that came up about, is it a defense for a company to say, well, that's a threat to you. I'm worried about your safety. And what we wrote in the ADA, and thought so carefully, was that it is a defense if the person poses a direct threat to others. Okay? And we really worked hard on getting it to be to others, to take out paternalism. So yeah, if you're going to be, you know, on a work site, and if you know, this is always the example. It's really, you're working with heavy machinery, and you're narcoleptic. This is like, these are always the kind of examples that come up in DC. You know, like, okay, which question are we being asked now? Like the narcoleptic machine operator. Okay. Anyway, so, okay, you're going to be a threat to others. You're going to like mow down all the people on the work site or whatever. You're going to chop them up or whatever. Okay, we're going to do direct threat to others. Sure enough, though, when a case came up under the ADA, went to the Supreme Court on that issue, there's no way that even with this language, I thought we crafted it really well. They could buy the concept that an employer had to hire someone or maintain, in this case, someone where there was a direct threat to themselves. It was like, no, we can't. No, you don't have to do that. And so in this particular case, it was a guy who had, worked in a chemical plant, and I think he had hepatitis or something. And, the chemicals weren't good for him. But he was making a life decision on his own that, well, I have this job, I don't know, like this job, or I need this job, or I need the money, or whatever it was. And the employer was like, no, we're not going to deal with that. And he won. I mean, they won. The employer won. Because still the concept of letting people make decisions like that for themselves is really hard to comprehend. And so if you think about it on an everyday level for a parent, or, people who feel like they're, one of the most insidious ways that disability discrimination has evidenced in the world is through good intentions. Good intentions have been a very, very big problem for people with disabilities. And that's interesting too. So disability, another thing that's been really interesting about disability in general is like, and I always hesitate, like, because I teach at Bolt, I'm always like, should I do this lecture or not do this lecture? Because people, I'm going to sound like, some kind of crazy radical, but people don't understand, like, why does the disability rights movement hate Jerry Lewis so much? Here's this nice, funny guy, devoted his life to helping these, Jerry's kids. Like, why do they hate him? And I always hesitate because I go, like, am I going to lose the audience? Do you have an opinion about that?
Sure.
You laugh.
About people
Yeah.
not understanding, you think?
About why the disability movement hates Jerry Lewis.
Wow. Well, I guess the new phrase that's come up in the community is inspiration porn.
Is
right?
what?
Inspiration porn.
Oh,
That's what people
Okay,
have been
okay.
saying. So I think that's how it would be described. Just exploiting disabled people and to raise money for this agency that does mostly research, I guess. MDA. But I guess it's broader than just what he does for the agency. I guess it's the way that the outcome of the whole telethon movement and how it kind of portrays disabled people in this light that affects the whole mainstream population, and how they then see disabled people as, you know, infants or children, you know, we never grow up, that kind of thing. Yeah. And it's very unhelpful. People either we're never going to grow up or we're going to die, right?
If you're never going to grow up, you're going to die.
Yeah, you're never going to grow up, you're going to die. You know, let's do the last wish. Let's try to make whatever life they have by going to summer camp happy. You know.
Does anyone else have any experience or had ever thought about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a broad assumption that a person with a disability or a child disability must have a shitty life. I mean, they have no quality of life. They're not having a blast. They're not having fun. They don't have, you know, hopes and dreams and adventures. And it's just like, I don't know. I guess you can keep that picture in your mind if you have people portraying that, like Telethons or Jerry Lewis, year in, year out, every Labor Day across an entire weekend. That, you know, will give them one little spark of joy, and the rest of their life is crap.
And they're all waiting for the cure.
And that you must be cured.
And
That
we're all waiting
that
for
you're
the cure. It's all about the cure.
That's where the
you're
happy life-
inherently wrong. You're a mistake, and we need to fix that mistake. Hopefully, we'll come up with that, and there won't be any more people like you.
Yeah.
Yay!
Yeah. I mean, I was asking you because you smiled, so I thought maybe you had a point of view about it.
Oh, no, I just agree. I feel like a lot of that portrays us as broken, and like we're just sitting here. That's what we're doing with our lives. We're kind of just sitting here waiting for somebody to cure us and fix us, and you know, instead of modeling that, I would say, why not fix the environment? Why not fix what's around us so we don't have to be fixed? But that's not what they want to portray. So
Yeah, and so it's like kind of the antithesis
Yes.
of like what people in the disability civil rights movement were trying to say. But the person who was very instrumental in getting the Americans with Disabilities Act even going, and who became the first chair of the EEOC, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, after the ADA was passed. His name is Evan Kapp. And he had MD, which is what the telethon's about, muscular dystrophy. And he was a Republican, which is why he could, I think he did that purposely for the movement, really, but he had a lot of entrees into the Republican Party because he was a bridge partner with Boyd and Gray, who was counsel to the president. And anyway, so, you know, all these kind of connections, they count no matter where you are, by the way. And so he was fanatic. He was so radical about disability. That's what I mean about, you know, but he was fanatic about the Jerry Lewis telethon. Several people, I mean, there's many people who have, like, really devoted a lot of their careers to this. And the reason is because he graduated top in his class from University of Virginia Law School, top-notch law school. He could not get a job. And his whole idea was, what's the opposite of what you want your lawyer to be? Dependent, infantilized, you know, childlike. He said, no, you want your lawyer to be like powerful and on top of things, and you know, and he really believed that it was actually preventing him from getting a job. Because, you know, it just, the image of him, because he had MD and used a electric wheelchair and et cetera, was that either he was like, well, we're not going to hire him, he's like on his way out the door, die, the big door. Or, you know, he's just going to need a lot of like help, or like our clients won't like him or whatever. So, you know, anyway, so there's always been this idea that it's harder to get the courts to understand disability discrimination because all of us have been raised very much with the idea that we have good and charitable feelings towards people with disabilities. I was going to say about also the question I asked about why the traditional civil rights groups have had a hard time accepting disability is because and it goes back to what we were talking about I'm the same, I'm not different, I'm not less than in any way, the whole struggle has been to say we're the same as you, and if disability just, it's right out there. It's just like we couldn't accept equal treatment because it had to be equal opportunity. It's the same thing. It's like, well, you know, I'm using a walker, you're not. I'm not the same, you know? So this idea is literally frightening to people who have spent decades struggling to say, I'm exactly the same as you. I have the same brain. So if you're intellectually disabled, you clearly, I mean, don't have the same brain. I have the same prowess. I have the same this. I have the same that. And it's interesting because my husband right now is reading a lot of books about theory, disability theory, and a lot of groups, I mean, a major part of their stigma has come from attributing disabilities to them. So a lot of what happened with Black Americans, for instance, is that they were presumed to be mentally retarded. So they were presumed to have mental disabilities, intellectual disabilities. So the last thing in the world that, you know, African American civil rights movement wants to do is, or like understands, like, wait, you're retarded, and which is now called intellectual disabilities, and I'm Black, and what are you saying that, you know, we have in common? And what we have in common, what everyone has in common is that there's barriers that have been erected by society that stop full potential. But it's hard, you know, when you've, like, your history comes from that. And same with gender, actually. You know, gender came from, you know, women are physically and mentally fragile. Like their brains are a different size, that if they vote, they're going to have nervous breakdowns. I mean, this is the history. And so it's like, no, we're strong, and we can take everything, and we're not going to have we're not going to be on that couch. We're not going to faint, you know. And so, no, it's like been a really big part of the feminist struggle also to show that we don't have any disabilities. We're not like weak. We're not like, you know, high strung. We're not like, you know, which is why it's been, you know, such a huge debate to even say we get pregnant. Well, we get pregnant, you know, like some of us, you know. And so, you know, asking for an accommodation for pregnancy was considered like, well, but then we'll like be admitting that we're different. But you're pregnant. You know, you might need something different. You know, you might need more bathroom breaks. What the hell, you know? And so that's so deeply ingrained that it's still 35 years later, maybe I'll end with this, a struggle to get disability civil rights completely understood, not only in the courts, but in, you know, our society and in even our civil rights movements. Yeah.
How do you do it, Arlene? I mean, can you point to some aha moments when you said the right thing or you gave the right example?
Well, I mean, going back to how we started the whole thing, I think that was smart, is to show that, you know, concentrating on what disability rights concentrates on, which is not like the inherent limitations of the individual, but the limitations that are imposed by society. I mean, that's just drumming that all the time. And then, there are examples where people can really get it. And you know what it is? It's just like, and the other civil rights movements have had to deal with this too. It's those examples where it's so obviously wrong. And where it's so obviously a barrier and not the person, which is, limiting too. But you should hear the debates about what cases go to the Supreme Court. I mean, it's all about, like, will they relate? And, so the case, we had a whole string of we had one really horrible case about whether the ADA was constitutional. And it was interesting. It involved a woman who had cancer and she wanted to come back to her job, and then it involved a guy who had asthma who wanted to enforce a non-smoking policy. It just went to the Supreme Court, and we got a very bad ruling. After that, people were like extremely particular about what the next case would be. The next case, it comes up through the lower courts. So the next case that got there, where the Supreme Court accepted cert, was a doctor who had mental illness. And everyone was like, we've got to get rid of that case. Can't go to the Supreme Court with that case. So that's an example of, where we just felt it couldn't be conveyed. It couldn't be conveyed that it was okay, that it might be perfectly legitimate to have a doctor that had a mental illness because he had been denied a license or something. So that case, people like flew to where that was and like, you got to settle that case. Lawyers, plaintiff lawyers, you got to settle that case regardless. And there were a few like that, and they came up because so aware of trying to make that connection. So when it became the case that was really chosen by the civil rights community, disability civil rights community, okay, you're going to court, and they say your courtroom's on the second floor, and there's no way to get there except for crawling. Okay, maybe someone could relate to that. Like, does that seem like equal access? Or, and I think that, it's a shame because, like, I've talked about this in my class, even with, when we did the Arline case, which was the case that was about AIDS. That was stigmatized. AIDS was stigmatized as a disability because at the time the Arline case came up, it was mainly, a lot of people call it the Arlene case, but I refuse because it's my name. But the group that was stigmatized was gay men, and that's mainly the population that had AIDS. And the debate we had within our civil rights community about the AIDS groups filing a brief. I'm like, no, you can't do that because we'll lose. Because you're associated with a stigmatized group. So we got a brief from who? The Hemophiliac Association. Because these were people who had AIDS who were innocent. So, I mean, it's really like, sometimes there's a lot of choosing who, when we had I always show this to my class too, and I could do this like periodically because then you could see things that the class sees. But, who was the witness on AIDS? It was a Southern young mother with children, and she was having a delivery of one of her children, and she got a blood transfusion, and she got AIDS. Oh my God. Okay, we can relate to that person. So some of it just involves a lot of like manipulation and compromise. I think that's unfortunate. I think in the special ed area, at least, as much trouble as we have with districts, I think we have gotten through in that area that, we don't have to prove that the kid is the same as the other kids. because everyone gets the idea that, they might not get the services we want them to get, but that they might need additional, the law requires them to, let's put it this way, the law requires them to have different services. But it's always interesting to figure out, like, how do you convey? And when I start in this class, I'm showing this hearing, how do we pick those witnesses? And before I show the film, I always ask the students, who would you pick? And there's always this idea we're going to try to pick people that seem like relatable to the members. But there's and then there's always someone in the class that's super offended by that, as they should be, because it's offensive. But, so there's always kind of like that game, I think. And I'd like to tell one last thing. So the other thing that, people don't understand at all is, and, liberals don't understand at all. So, I was thinking, like, everyone always says in my classes, I've been teaching it for like a lot of years, everyone always puts a famous person with a disability. So that all, because then you can relate. And it's like, so who was the big famous person with a disability? Was Superman. What's his name?
Christopher Reeves.
Huh? Christopher Reeves. Okay, fine. So Christopher Reeves is a quadriplegic. He comes out for the first, whatever it was, Academy Awards or whatever the hell it was, and the whole audience stands up and starts clapping. And trying to convey why the disability community felt that was offensive is, oh my God, the gap cannot be bridged. Like, you're looking like, oh my God, that you totally get that.
He was looking for the cure.
Huh?
He was looking for the cure.
Even besides that,
Yeah.
even if he was whatever he all he did was appear, and everyone stands up and gives him a standing ovation, because it was like, oh my God, Superman, Christopher Reeve. I mean, it's kind of amazing, actually, when you think of someone should write a story on that one. Superman is a quadriplegic using an electric chair. And I really feel like the standing ovation was, look at how brave he is for showing his face.
Oh, exactly. I mean, let's face it, he's a mediocre actor anyway. I mean,
Huh?
he was okay, but he was kind of a mediocre actor anyway. It wasn't like Sean Penn or something. Yeah, but it was obviously just because he was in a wheelchair.
I think he was liked.
He was liked, but yeah, it was very offensive.
Yeah. And now there's things like, I saw on Facebook this girl who, I follow this disability stuff. It's a great source for that. I hate to say it, but it is. And she was like a young girl with Down syndrome. She got a big award from her town. And her parents and her were like, and she was like, all I do is like stay home and watch reruns of Buffy the Vampire Killer. Like, I just like do I go to the pizza parlor. I like, what am I getting an award for? Like, I don't understand. And her parents were like, she's not really that exceptional. Like, she's like, we scream at her to do her homework, and she's like, not that interesting. I mean, I don't know, So it's like, there's still a whole lot of interesting, fascinating issues. That's it, because that's 12:30. We could have disability roundtable talks all the time. They're interesting. I'm almost interested myself. Thank you all for coming, though.
Thank you.